on the Lyric Concert.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Herriott on behalf of the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra, RTÉ Lyric FM. It's a great pleasure to welcome, as always, on a Friday night, all of you here, all of you listening, and all of you joining us right now on the live stream to this lyric concert, coming to you live from the National Concert Hall here in Dublin. It says a great deal for the esteem in which the great Finnish nationalist Jan Sibelius was held that the government decided to honour his 50th birthday as a public holiday. Well, needless to say, Sibelius was compelled to respond accordingly, and not surprisingly, he came up with a major work, his Symphony No. 5. What is also more of a surprise, I think, in this case, is the fact that it was much more difficult for him than he might have realized, and not even the idyllic surroundings of the lakeside home that the family owned near Järvenpää, near Helsinki, could provide the kind of inspiration and the drive to really finish this work to perfection, or at least as he saw it. It took 2 major revisions before it emerged in the way that we recognize it today, 4 years later, in 1919. We do know, however, that it was apparently the sight of 16 swans flying overhead, perhaps on their way to the marshes in the Arctic Circle in Laminka to feed, that provided Sibelius with one of the major impressions of his life, and it's found its way into this work towards the end. The almighty Norse god Thor swings his hammer to complete the picture, and we're going to see it all in the second half of our program tonight. Light-hearted and brilliant, the very words of Maurice Ravel, as he literally cracks the whip and introduces us to the spirit of the age through his Piano Concerto in G. Now, this is a work that is very redolent of the 1920s. In France, in particular, it's full of the jazz influence that was sweeping Europe at that time. Javier Perianes is the pianist who joins the orchestra for this work a little bit later. But to begin with, sometimes it really is perfectly all right to get carried away, particularly by a magic carpet. The great Dane Carl Nielsen somehow managed to find time in 1919 to write the incidental music for a production by the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen of Aladdin. And it's probably true to say that this is some of the classiest music that has ever been written for a pantomime. Before we hear it, can I ask you, please, to welcome the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra and leader, Helena Wood. And time to introduce the second half of our distinguished Spanish double this evening. Guest conductor, Jaime Martin. seventh dance there from the 7 pieces from Aladdin by the Danish composer Carl Nielsen. And that has to be surely one of the undiscovered highlights of this season. Those incredible pieces, short pieces that really bring that story to life. And it's somewhat of an unexpected work, I think. It's unfamiliar to most of us. And as I say, written by Carl Nielsen for the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen in 1919 for a production of Aladdin. Surely one of the classiest pieces of incidental music ever written for a pantomime. Beginning with the Oriental Festival March, Aladdin's dream and dance of the morning mist, the Hindu dance, the Chinese dance, the marketplace in Ishthan, and the prisoner's dance. Those 7 pieces from Carl Nielsen's Aladdin and the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra under the direction of guest conductor Jaime Martin. Jaime Martin, hugely popular Spanish conductor, returns this week to join the orchestra again. And we move on to the second part of our programme this evening. Maurice Ravel, of course, known for his great impressions of Spain. But tonight we're going to hear his piano concerto in G major, written between the years of 1929 and 1939. Now, this is a work that is surely remarkable and for a great many reasons. Not only in itself, but also because, and surely, of the huge circumstances that surrounded it. In 1929, Ravel was riding the crest of a wave. In his mid-50s, he'd become internationally regarded through the popularity of his ballet Bolero. Well, I'm going to tell you more about this work a little later on as we prepare now to hear it. But taking us in that direction, because of course, being a piano concerto, we really do, of course, a little bit of time to bring the Steinway on and to rearrange the set for the orchestra. And while we're doing that, I want you to hear this recent recording of Franz Schubert's Nacht und Traum. Gian Soltani and Aaron Pilsan at the piano, Gian Soltani, the cellist. Arpeggione Sonata by Franz Schubert in that new recording with Kian Soltani, the cellist, and Arne Pilson at the piano. Paul Herriott with you here at the National Concert Hall in Dublin as our Friday concert continues this evening with the Piano Concerto in G major by Maurice Ravel, written between the years of 1929 and 31. Ravel riding the crest of a wave. Now in his mid-50s, he'd become internationally regarded through the popularity of his ballet, Bolero. And this had been followed by a hugely successful concert tour of America. So the time really was ripe for what had been his long-time ambition of creating a piano concerto. It would be something different, and indeed, not surprisingly, on the back of his American tour, the jazz phenomenon that had swept the States and created just as much of a stir in Paris certainly claimed its influence here. Ravel was a man possessed, totally absorbed in its creation, breaking and only occasionally one of those being able to attend a festival in his honour in Biarritz when he was to write to a friend, "In the midst of my pregnancy with the concerto, I find myself called to Biarritz." Well, just about able to conduct the first performance of his concerto in 1931 when by a cruel stroke of fate he was struck down with illness. He had to pass the score over to Marguerite Long. But tonight, Javier Perianes, the Spanish pianist with the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra under the direction of Jaime Martin. Ravel's Piano Concerto in G. That spectacular piano concerto in G by Maurice Ravel, and that famous whiplash at the beginning, introducing us to the spirit of the age. The 1920s, well, it was first performed in 1931, but the 1920s really when jazz was invading all of Europe, and as you could hear, along with the Basque and Spanish sound, so much a part of Ravel's childhood, fused with the new jazz style that he loved, we have the perfect representation of the composer at the very height of his powers. Javier Perianes, the Spanish pianist, joining the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra under the direction of Jaime Martin. So it is a wonderful Spanish double that we have here this evening, injecting this programme with all the heat and the enthusiasm of the audience here at the National Concert Hall in Dublin. Really does say it all. Jaime Martin, much loved by the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra, returning for a guest appearance with the orchestra tonight. And asking, entreating various sections to stand after that extraordinary performance, and now joining his countryman Javier Perianes to accept the applause tonight. Bringing some warmth into this concert hall. Of course, we were freezed out of it, alas, last weekend, unable to make the concert. But what a warm beginning to tonight's programme, and an encore. And that very pretty notturno from Edvard Grieg's lyric pieces and encore this evening from the Spanish pianist Javier Perianes. Javier Perianes, who along with Jaime Martin has really, as I say, introduced a bit of heat into our programme this week, having been frozen out of our home last week. We've turned the temperature up, and that reception from the crowd here at the National Concert Hall in Dublin, recognising the great contrast, I think, between the gentleness of that notturno and the heat that came before. But we remain in Scandinavian territory in the second half of our concert tonight. The RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra and leader Helena Wood, under the direction of Jaime Martin, complete the programme with the Symphony No. 5 in E-flat by Jan Sibelius. The sound of Finland then coming up in the second half of our concert tonight. And during the interval now, it's Sandy Burnett who reflects on the great success story of Finnish music and the early life of the man who did the most to bring that about. Although we do start in somewhat unusual musical territory.
Stradivarius often gets an airing here on Lyric, but that was the sound of Stratovarius, one of Finland's heavy metal bands. And there are plenty of those. Europe's northerly outpost has the highest concentration of metal bands anywhere in the world. According to the most recent statistics, 3,400 in a population of 6.5 million. That's the noisy end of a rich range of musical activity in this small country, which boasts 13 professional orchestras, a great track record of producing world-renowned conductors and soloists, summer music festivals devoted to everything from opera to rock, and a thriving folk scene blending elements from east and west based around their traditional lap harp instrument, the kantele. As for Stratovarius, the bass player in that band, Lauri Porra, is a composer too. He's written scores for feature films, TV series and commercials. Porra is carrying on the family tradition in a 21st century kind of way because his extremely famous great-grandfather is Finland's greatest composer and a national icon, Jean Sibelius, the country boy who rose from being a provincial outsider to occupying a central role in his country's consciousness. And in this brief interval feature, I'm going to chart his progress from one to the other. A silver spoon was very far from the mouth of the infant Jean Sibelius. He was born on the 8th of December 1865 in the inland garrison town of Hämeenlinna, and his start in life wasn't easy. His father died young and the family grew up poor. Young Janne played the out-of-tune square piano at home and then the violin, not getting his first proper music lessons until the age of 16. He taught himself harmony and music theory out of a book, started to compose, and after taking up a place at Helsinki University to study law, he was allowed to register as a special student at the conservatory. That's where things really got going for him. One of Sibelius's most charismatic teachers there was the brilliant, dashing and eccentric Ferruccio Busoni, who used to let his huge dog Lesko sit in on the piano lessons he gave to Sibelius and his two great friends Armas Järnefelt and Adolf Paul. They became real Busoni groupies, even calling themselves the Leskovites after Busoni's dog. Away from the conservatory, Armas Jarnefelt took him to meet his family. And to cut a long story short, Sibelius fell in love with his sister Aino and married her. The Jarnefelts were quite a family. The father was governor of the district of Kuopio, then Vasa, as well as Armas, the musician. His brother Eero was studying to be an artist, and Arvid was planning a new Finnish newspaper. All of the family were strong believers in Finnish language and culture, something that wasn't lost on Sibelius. In his early 20s, he got a grant to go and study in Berlin and then Vienna. These were two of Europe's outstanding musical capitals at the time, making Helsinki look like a dusty backwater. But at the same time, the young composer wasn't 100% convinced by the culture there, especially their resistance to new ideas. As Sibelius put it at the time, the Germans are far too conventional. They loathe both the French and the Russians, and cannot talk about anything Scandinavian without trotting out the usual nonsense about barbarians. Sibelius saw the way forward for the kind of music he was going to write through the pages of the Kalevala, the national epic of Karelia and Finland, and the single most significant work of Finnish literature. Originally unwritten, it was compiled by Elias Lönnrot in the mid-19th century from Karelian and Finnish oral folklore and mythology. Lönnrot's Kalevala has 22,795 verses, divided into 50 songs or runot. In later years, Sibelius was to travel to Karelia and spend time with runo singers as they sang long tales of heroic deeds in hypnotically repetitive verses. Well, here's an example of the kind of thing Sibelius could have heard. This is an archive recording of the famous runo singer Anni Tennisova, just 13 years younger than Sibelius himself, telling the story of Väinämöinen's wounded knee. This is the moment in the Kalevala which describes how the devil jolts Väinämöinen's axe as he's carving a boat. The blade slices into his knee, blood spills out, and he recites charms to try and stop the bleeding.
Vanha vuori Väinämöini vesti vuorella venettä. Kolkutteli kallivolla, kilpesty kirveskivehe. Polvehe pojan polote, vanha vuori Väinämöisen. Läppipä hänet timää, veren turvan tukkijoa. Ensimmäistä tietä myöti, ensimmäiseen taloon. Ukko unilta puhuve, vanha vuori vaipaan alta.
Sibelius wanted to see if he could use the rhythms of his language to make a new Finnish type of song, and to reproduce what he called that melodious, strangely melancholic monotony which is in all Finnish melodies. His first attempt was the huge choral symphony Kullervo, first performed to astounding effect in Helsinki on the 28th of April 1892. It was like a volcanic eruption. A pupil of Sibelius, Axel Tornud, recollected. Most of the listeners thought it was complete chaos. The composer and critic Oscar Mericanto thought that he wasn't sure about the work, but he did say the composer had taken a long step forward with this work and, at the same time, taken Finnish art towards a highly promising future. Mericanto continued, "The whole composition is, due to its Finnish content, the most impressive and powerful work ever to have come from a Finnish pen." Throughout the 1890s, Sibelius refined and deepened his exploration of a Finnish kind of music in the company of creative men who shared his vision. One was the artist Axel Galén, later Akseli Galén-Kallela. Another was the conductor Robert Kajanus, and a third was Oscar Mericanto, who I've just mentioned. Together, they went by the name of the Symposium Group. often gathering at Helsinki's centrally located hotel camp after concerts to chew the fat over cigars and drinking several glasses of Benedictine. A scene that was immortalised in Axel Gallain's famous painting symposium of 1894, which depicts the four looking distinctly the worse for wear. The painting led to Sibelius becoming labelled as a hard-drinking artist and made it even more difficult for him to get loans. Nevertheless, the composer later recollected those legendary symposium nights with pleasure. They meant a great deal to me at a time when I would otherwise have been more or less alone, he said. Whether his young wife Aino would have agreed, stuck at home with 2 young children, is another matter. Another famous Finnish painting from around this time was Attack by Edvard Isto, a fiercely nationalist work showing the 2-headed eagle of Russia tearing the Book of Law out of the arms of the Finnish maiden. Allegorical, but true to life. Tensions were rising in Finland against the Russian rulers who'd been governing the country ever since 1809 in an increasingly prescriptive way. In recent years, the Finnish post office had come under Russian control. Russian became the official language for administration. Finns were being forced to serve in the Russian army. And the press was coming under increasing threat of censorship too, with one liberal newspaper being shut down for 3 months. This last move led to a gala evening called the Press Celebrations being put on in Helsinki, to which anyone who was anyone in Finland was invited. Ostensibly it was to raise money for a pension fund for journalists. But in reality, the whole thing was an excuse for a protest against Russian rule and the detested Governor-General Nikolai Bobrikov in particular. 6 increasingly intense tableaux featuring key moments in Finnish histories were accompanied by a specially commissioned score by Sibelius. And his music for the last of them is the one that's made the most enduring impression. Suomi herää, or Finland Awakes, was a thinly disguised call to arms for the Finnish people. Over the next few months, Kajanos and Sibelius conducted some of the musical highlights from the score in Helsinki and Turku, and took the finale of the suite on the Helsinki Philharmonic Orchestra's European tour, ending up at the World Fair in Paris in the year 1900. At this early stage, it went by the name of Vaterland, La Patrie, or simply Suomi, which means Finland. But when Axel Karpelan, one of Sibelius' most influential supporters, suggested the title of Finlandia, that name stuck. The unforgettable main melody has been reworked as a standalone hymn, and it's been played at countless ceremonial occasions. The great conductor Leopold Stokowski was one of the first to record Finlandia with his Philadelphia Orchestra in 1921, and in his opinion, it should become the national anthem of the whole world. And maybe Stokowski is right. It might have been written for a local celebration, but the spirit of Sibelius' score has a power which comes over as entirely universal.
Sandy Burnett there, reflecting on the great success story of Finnish music in the, of course, early life of the man who did the most to bring that about. Paul Herriott with you here at the National Concert Hall in Dublin with our lyric concert tonight, the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra. Leader, of course, Helena Wood, and under the direction of Jaime Martin. And it says a great deal as regards the high esteem in which Sibelius was held at the time, not to mention, of course, the appreciation that on the occasion of his 50th birthday in 1915, not only did the government request a special celebratory work, but declared the very day itself a national holiday. Now, how in reality the great man himself reacted to all of this, we might assume to be positive. But in reality, however, the commission itself turned out to be, well, rather less simple. The early years of the 20th century, particularly after 1910, were to herald radical changes within the modernist movement. The second Viennese school, as it was referred to, was on the rise, led by the likes of Arnold Schoenberg, for example. And then, of course, there was the Impressionism of Ravel, who we heard from earlier, not to mention Claude Debussy and the young Igor Stravinsky, all making their mark. And it seems composers the likes of Sibelius found all of this somewhat disconcerting, to say the very least. Well, indeed, whilst he was working on the work that would result from all of this, his Symphony No. 5 in E-flat major that we're going to hear next, he was to remark, "It is as if God Almighty had thrown down pieces of a mosaic for heaven's floor and asked me to find out what was the original pattern." Well, the result, it seems, was revision, a considerable amount of it, as Sibelius set about defining and redefining both his own and the expectations of a country. Revised then versions would emerge in 1916 and again, as we hear it tonight, in 1919. One of the more romantic stories that lies behind the inspiration here is of how Sibelius adored painting at the family's country estate in Ola, an idyllic lakeside setting where he lived with his wife and family. And the painting was of swans in flight. One of his greatest impressions, it's found here, the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Jaime Martin, the Sibelius Symphony No. 5. Thank you. And the great Norse god Thor swings his hammer, bringing that picture, painted by Jan Sibelius, to such a glorious end. His Symphony No. 5 in E-flat, Opus 82, and that gift to the people of Finland in return for marking his 50th birthday, actually 4 years earlier, as a national holiday. Says something for the esteem in which the great nationalist was held in 1915, when he began the long journey that led to that magnificent conclusion, because it did take three versions to reach fulfilment. Beginning as it did with those 16 swans in flight, providing Sibelius with one of the great impressions of his life. Just two of the legends that lie behind this Symphony No. 5 in E-flat with the RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra. Leader Helena Wood, under the direction this evening of Jaime Martin. And that extraordinary and enigmatic work by Sibelius that took a long time to bring to fruition, bringing to an end a glorious and very contrasting programme tonight, beginning with that magic carpet ride, Carl Nielsen's Aladdin, and of course the wonderful spirit of the age, the force of nature, that is Ravel's Piano Concerto in G, with the other half of our distinguished Spanish duo tonight, Javier Perianes, the pianist, joining the orchestra. And so it brings to an end then our evening of music, our lyric concert here at the National Concert Hall. I'm Paul Herriott, on behalf of all of us here. Can I wish you a very good weekend wherever you might happen to be listening, and handing over, as always, on a Friday, to Ellen and Vespertine.
The RTÉ National Symphony Orchestra. Love your orchestras.